So welcome everybody. I'm Dina Heshmat, Assistant Professor of Arabic Literature at AUC and Acting Director of the Center for Translation Studies, and I will be moderating today's talk, the Center's first online lecture, titled The Vehicle for Multilingualism, Simultaneous Interpretation at the UN. I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers for today, two interpreters who have many years of experience in the field. So Mustafa Hashish, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Arabic interpreter at the UN headquarters in New York. And Alice Rijkmans. Hello, Alice.
Hello.
French interpreter at the UN office in Vienna. Mustafa Hashish joined the UN as an Arabic interpreter in May 2013. For several years before that, he was a freelance writer, translator, and development consultant in Cairo. Mustafa is an AUC alumnus. He got his BA in accounting in 2000 and his MA in teaching Arabic as a foreign language in 2011. Alice Rijkmans joined the UN in 2011. She studied at the University of Mons, Belgium, the Pushkin Institute in Moscow, and the University of Brussels. They will both say more about their personal journey towards interpreting towards the presentation. I'm delighted as well to welcome hundreds of persons from all over the world in this virtual setting. It is one of the paradoxes of the current situation that while many of us still live under lockdown, it somehow brings us closer to each other. Present in the audience today are professional interpreters from all across the globe, students and faculty from universities all across Egypt, from Alexandria to Minya, including of course AUC, Cairo, Ain Shams, and Al-Azhar universities, but also from universities in Geneva, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Abidjan, Algiers, Rabat, Ottawa, among many others. Before I pass the floor to the speakers, I want to thank Dr. Samia Mehriz Hasdin, Dr. Zainab Taha, and all the colleagues from the Events Support Service and IT, as well as Iman Zarif from CTS for making this event possible. The lecture will last around 45-50 minutes, and then I will open the floor to questions. You can send me your questions or contributions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them to the panelists after the lecture. Or you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen. I will then unmute you so that you can contribute to the discussion. So all of this will take place after Mustafa and Alice finish the talk. So finally, I would like to mention that the talk is recorded and will be published on the CTS website. So Mustafa and Alice, the floor is yours. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dina Heshmat. Thank you very much for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here, to be something of a connecting bridge between the two institutions that have influenced my life the most, AUC and the United Nations. It's a pleasure to be here. We are very flattered by the high level of interest. Thank you all for attending, for coming to this virtual space. We're very happy to have you. We hope you will enjoy and benefit somewhat from our presentation. We realize there are so many fellow professional interpreters in the audience. In the beginning, that was not our expectation. So hopefully you will still benefit, even though I know many have come to the United Nations as freelancers, perhaps among the audience members. As always with these Zoom meetings, the Q&A can be very interesting at the end. So please raise anything that you would like to be further discussed or focused on, and we shall engage in a nice interactive session at the end. I will be speaking primarily in English. I will start sharing my screen now. Our presentation is just, the purpose is to give you a glimpse, a taste of simultaneous interpretation at the United Nations. We will talk a little about the United Nations and the context for multilingualism at the United Nations, and we will discuss the perspective of interpreters, and of course we'll talk a little about simultaneous interpretation and a brief history about it and the official languages at the UN. So it will, in the end, be an introduction to what simultaneous interpretation is like in the context of multilingual multilateralism. I'm very happy to be joined today by my dear colleague and friend Alice Rickmans. Alice really embodies multilingualism as an interpreter. She interprets from Russian, English, and Spanish into her mother tongue, French, and she also is fluent at Dutch and German. So she's really as multilingual can be. And I'm very happy she's able to join me today. And I would like to pass to her for some introductory remarks. Please.
شكرا مصطفى. أيها الزملاء والأعزاء مساء الخير. So that was, I hope, understandable. I do not speak Arabic, but since the theme of our talk today is multilingualism, I thought I might have a try. So thank you very much, Mustafa, and thank you very much, Professor Dina, for hosting us. And as you said, Mustafa, I think that the added value of this little talk, I hope it will have an added value, of course, will be to give the point of view of an insider, as you said, the glimpse from inside of what our job is like. And I think it's also for us an opportunity to share something we're really passionate about, interpreting at the UN, which is an organization that is really very close to our hearts, obviously.
Thank you, Alice, very much. So just briefly, this title slide represents what we will discuss. On one hand, you have the image of the Secretariat building in New York, this iconic image of the UN headquarters in New York, the context in which we work. And the other image is the only image that I personally took that is in this presentation. You will see that there are many pictures in this presentation. And this is the viewpoint from our seat as Arabic interpreters in the Security Council. This is the Arabic interpretation booth and the view of the Security Council at the United Nations. So we will move on from here to the 4 duty stations of the United Nations. We call these the duty stations. They are the largest offices of the United Nations. Of course, the UN operates in every part of the globe. These duty stations are the largest offices of the United Nations, and they are the only offices that employ full-time interpreters. There will be other language professionals in other offices around the globe. For example, the tribunal in Lebanon. However, the only full-time interpreters are in the 4 duty stations. In New York, we, of course, are home to the 3 main organs that make up the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council. And of course, it is also home to the 6 main committees. We will talk a little more about that later. And then in Geneva, Geneva is also a very active duty station, and it's most famous for the Human Rights Council. And it also houses many of the entities that make up the disarmament machinery, what we call in Arabic, aliyat naz' al-silah. So there are in Geneva, there are treaty bodies, hay'at munsha'a bimujab mu'ahadat, such as the Conference on Disarmament or the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention, اتفاقية الألغام المضادة للأفراد, Convention on Cluster Munitions, اتفاقية الذخائر العنقودية, etc. So that's the one of the main activities that take place in Geneva. And Alice will tell us about Nairobi and Vienna.
Yes, and thank you for saying this, Mustafa, that there's not only New York, the UN is a bit everywhere, and the other duty stations count, of course, as well. So in Nairobi, In Nairobi, you have, I mean, the conference services in Nairobi cover the meetings of UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, and of UN Habitat, which is the Human Settlement Programme of the UN. And our colleagues in Nairobi are probably the ones who travel the most. I mean, the most. They travel a lot. They have a lot of missions. They cover a lot of conferences in Africa and in Asia. And I remember a dear colleague from the Arabic booth who told me that she always had 2 suitcases ready. So she came back from a mission and literally she took the other one and she went, left for another mission. So this is something we probably have less in other duty stations. Even if we have missions, we'll talk about that as well. In Vienna, we cover the meetings of several bodies. The main ones are the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, with its 2 commissions. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the INCB, which is the International Narcotic Control Board. We also cover meetings for other VBOs, and VBOs, that is just Vienna-based organizations, like, of course, the IAEA, the Atomic Agency, the Preparatory Commission for the CTBTO, which is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, and we also cover the meetings of UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. These are the main ones. And what happens is sometimes we have missions. We cover usually conferences that are from our organizations, let's say. For instance, HONLEA, the heads of drug and law enforcement of different countries. You have HONLEA Africa, HONLEA Latin America, or in Asia. And we can also go on a mission on loan, which means that if another duty station experience an increase in its workload, we could be sent over there just to support them. So that's what happens in Vienna. Drugs, crime, nuclear testing, nuclear energy, that's our stuff.
Thank you, Alice. I think from the level of technical content that you interpret in Vienna, I'm afraid you could assemble a nuclear bomb yourself, but I'll try not to worry about that and not think about it too much. So now to take a somewhat bird's eye view of multilingualism at the United Nations. Multilingualism is a core value of the United Nations. It enables effective operation. It's a manifestation of the diversity and the unity of the member states. There are currently 193 member states in the United Nations. It enables tolerance and facilitates communication, of course. So it really is at the core of the United Nations mission. And this excerpt, it's scanned from 1940, well, the record of it is from 1946, and it's only twisted because that's what the only form in which it is available. And this is from, you can see the date, the 1st of February, 1946. So from the very beginning, multilingualism has been at the heart of the United Nations operation, with at that time, five official languages. So we will get to the official languages later. This other image is of the first ever Secretary General of the United Nations. And in fact, this image was taken just this following day of February 2nd, 1946, and it was in London at the time. The session of the General Assembly was there. And his name, he was Norwegian, I will attempt to pronounce it. Please do not hold me accountable. Trygve Lie, or Lie. So that was him, and the first Secretary General of the United Nations. Alice?
Yes, as you said, Mustafa, multilingualism is really at the core of the United Nations, so much so that the General Assembly adopts a resolution on multilingualism each year. So I went to check on the last one that was in September last year, in 2019. And it's in the preamble, it says, recognizes that multilingualism as a core value of the organization contributes to the achievement of the goals of the UN. So it's very clear that it's extremely important for all of us. I would like to add as well that when we will talk maybe about that, I won't give too much figures, numbers, and numbers of resolution, but there's another resolution that is very important as well. That is one on the pattern of conferences. And that resolution is the one requesting the Secretary General to intensify all outreach activities, partnerships with universities to better cover our needs in the language services. So I just wanted to say that these two resolutions are very explicit. There's no ambiguity. Multilateralism is core to everything we do, and it's our raison d'être as well. Thanks to multilateralism, we earn our daily bread. And the resolution of the pattern of conferences is the one asking us to do exactly what we're doing now.
Thank you, Elise. And I agree that multilateralism and multilingualism can almost be interchangeable. I think you maybe meant to say multilingualism when you said multilateralism. And multilateralism is what we call in Arabic al-nizam muta'addid al-atraf or ta'addud al-atraf. And of course, multilateralism cannot be multilateralism if it was monolingual. So multilingualism is essential for multilateralism. And thank you for mentioning the pattern of conferences, because this is one of the interesting translations. It's not a literal translation, and in Arabic we call that khittat al-mu'tamarat, because it's the plan, in fact, for the projected plan for conferences. Now we take a look at the organizational enablers of multilingualism. The title of our presentation is called The Vehicle for Multilingualism, Simultaneous Interpretation at the United Nations, but in fact, not only simultaneous interpretation is the vehicle for multilingualism. The General Assembly has mandated the Under-Secretary General, Wakil al-Amin al-Am, for DGACM, the Department of General Assembly and Conference Management. Just quickly, I'll let you know that this is إدارة الجمعية العامة وشؤون المؤتمرات. And he is responsible, he's the Secretariat-wide coordinator for multilingualism. And what that means is he oversees all the services and divisions that facilitate and enable multilingualism in the official languages. And also he is the contact point for the member states on everything that involves or concerns the multilingualism and the official languages. I'm sure this second bullet point looks like gibberish to everyone. DGACM MPD is the Meetings and Publishing Division, and under that is the Interpretation Service, IS, which employs us. And also within the Meetings and Publishing Division is the verbatim reporting, al-mahadar al-shafawiyya. And these are the verbatim records of the meetings that take place at the United Nations that are also issued in the official languages. And under the Documentation Division, we have the Translation Service, which is responsible for document translation into the official languages. And in this image, we see from left to right, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and the current President of the General Assembly, Mr. Mohamed Tijani Bandi from Nigeria, and the current USG for DGACM, Mr. Mobzes Abilyan. So they represent the highest top of multilingualism and further up of the organization. Elise?
Yes, so you were just explaining who were the enablers at the top, and then you have all the other ones who are also enablers, but at other levels maybe. But I think there are about 2,000 staff members working in our department. Our DGACM is the largest department of the Secretariat, actually, and that's worldwide. I wanted to stress here the importance of teamwork, because as you said, Mustafa, we are not working alone as interpreters. When we prepare a meeting, we can do that, and we are enabled to do that just because we have access to the translated documents. And that's thanks to our colleagues, the translators, of course. So we depend on them to be able to do our job. And then we interpret, and our interpretation is used precisely for the verbatim, by the précis writers, the editors, to prepare other documents. So I would say it's, we're all interdependent, and it creates a kind of a virtuous circle. Everyone adds value to what we're doing, and we need each other. And I'm, of course, very grateful as well to all our colleagues from the conference services, the conference offices who bring the speeches. I mean, it's sometimes life saving for us to receive them. So it's a very clearly a teamwork when we are in the booth.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for mentioning the virtuous circle, because I only learned this term from Alice recently, and I didn't know this concept existed, and I really love the idea, the virtuous circle, and it's in contrary to the vicious circle. So we definitely need more virtuous circles in the world. Moving on, these are the 6 official languages of the United Nations. Arabic, as we said, the 5 official languages existed since 1946, and then Arabic was only added during the 28th session of the General Assembly in 1973. And then the difference between a working language and an official language is that English and French as working languages are the languages of the Secretariat. So inside the United Nations Secretariat and carrying out the day-to-day operations, English and French are used as working languages. However, there is a strongly, a firm concept of the parity of the official languages that the United Nations General Assembly is very strongly committed to. So there is conceptual parity between the 6 official languages. And this image, in fact, you might not be able to tell, but this image is in fact from the 1973 General Assembly session. Alice.
Yes, as you said, Mustafa, the working languages and official languages are somehow different. It happens that all 6 languages are actually official and working languages in the General Assembly and the Security Council. In the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, you have 6 official languages and 3 working languages, which are English, French, and Spanish. And in the Secretariat, as you said, we have French and English. Yes, exactly. And everyone is encouraged to use all these languages, or as much as he or she can, a language that he masters that is not necessarily his or her mother tongue.
Thank you. We will now zoom in a little on simultaneous interpretation. We will not spend too much time here because it is clear so many people in our audience know a lot of this. So quickly, consecutive interpretation existed, and I think everyone can, it's a little self-explanatory. Consecutive interpretation is when the speaker speaks and then pauses or stops, and the interpreter interprets the passage that the speaker uttered. And that form of interpretation is as old as languages themselves. And we all know Turguman, the Arabic word that was integrated into Turkish during Ottoman times, Turkmen, which was also westernized into European languages as Drogman and Darogman, all coming from the original Arabic Turguman, which is interpreter. Then the turning point was the Nuremberg trials, which Alice will tell us about.
Yes, actually, the real start of simultaneous interpreting was indeed during the Nuremberg trials. There had been some attempts before in 28 for the Comintern. I think it was the 6th Comintern in the Soviet Union. And even before that, there was an American philanthropist called Edward Philaine, who suggested in front of the League of Nations to have a try and try to use a phone and a mic to produce something at the same time as the speaker. And a lot of people thought it was completely crazy to do that, and it was unnecessary. And when you think about what it is for us now to be able to work in simultaneously, you just can't imagine that we would have to do everything now again in consecutive, because it would take, I mean, at least twice as much time, or maybe almost. So it would not be very easy to organize meetings that way. So there was a very good exhibition organized by AIC, precisely, I think it was in 2017 that it was in New York in the Vienna Cafe in the Secretariat of the UN. A very interesting exhibition that has been actually shown in several places in the world, and if you have the opportunity to go and see it, well, it's really worth it.
Thank you, Alice. And then the profession. So that was the birth of simultaneous interpretation, and it was IBM that facilitated it strongly during the Nuremberg trials, and the profession became well established and spread quickly, and eventually the AIC was founded in 1953. The AIC is somewhat a syndicate or a union of interpreters, international interpreters. This is the French acronym, L'Association Internationale des Interprètes de Conférence, the International Association for Conference Interpreters, and AIC is very strongly involved in all working conditions, establishment and negotiation for interpreters and for its members. So how does simultaneous interpretation within the context of multilateralism work at the United Nations? So we've mentioned we have 6 official languages, and we divide them into 4 and 2. So 4 booths of 2 and 2 booths of 3. This is not immediately understandable. Many of you may already know, but there are 4 booths of 2 interpreters in each booth, and then 2 booths of 3 interpreters in each booth. And many of you may have already guessed, if you don't know already, that it is Arabic and Chinese that have 3 booths in each, interpreters in each booth. And the reason for this is because us and our colleagues in the Chinese booth have 2 active languages. We interpret in both directions. So we interpret into Arabic, and we also interpret into either one of the working languages, either English or French. We're almost evenly divided. I think maybe slightly more than half of us are Francophones, meaning that they interpret from Arabic into French. And the rest of us are Anglophones. We interpret from Arabic into English. And while many of us interpret from both English and French into Arabic, and some do Spanish as well in the Arabic booth, but all of us are hired to do one output language. So we cannot alternate our output languages. And by contrast, in the other 4 languages, English, French, Spanish and Russian, there are two interpreters and they have to have two passive languages, unlike us where one is enough to be hired, two passive languages and one active language, which is their mother tongue. So that's the setup, and Alice will tell us about the relay system.
Yes, so the relay system is means to take over from someone. As you mentioned, Mustafa, when someone speaks Arabic, for instance, in the room, I don't understand Arabic. So in Vienna, for instance, I will switch and I will listen and see whether it's a French-speaking Arabic colleague starting or an English-speaking one. If it's French, I will shut my mic and I won't work for that speech because it's already covered by my colleague. But if it's in English, then I will just take the relay thanks to this colleague, and I will work from this English of this colleague into French. Same for my Spanish colleagues, or my colleagues from the Spanish booth, from the Russian booth, and from the English booth. So that's how it works. The relay works as well for other languages, meaning that, for instance, in the French and English booth, we usually have at least one colleague who has Spanish and the other one Russian, sometimes both, which means that there is one what we call Russisant and one Hispanisant, one who knows Russian, the other one Spanish, in the English booth and in the French booth. And there we have to make sure there's always someone covering one of these two languages, in the booth. If I'm covering Russian in my booth, French booth, I have to make sure there is someone covering Spanish if I don't have Spanish in the English booth, to be absolutely sure that if someone speaks Spanish in the room, there will be interpretation. And so other colleagues will just take relay on us when someone speaks Spanish or when someone speaks Russian. And as you said, there are some colleagues in the Spanish booth who have also Russian, some colleagues from the Russian booth who have Spanish. So, of course, the more you know, the better, because it makes the work of the programming officer much easier.
Thank you, Alice. And this image is an image of the General Assembly Hall from, I think it's the Spanish booth. We have the Arabic and Chinese on the other side, the far side from this image, from this viewpoint. And from the location, from the angle, I think this is the Spanish booth and that this is the view from the Spanish booth of the General Assembly Hall. So very quickly, conference versus community interpretation. Alice.
Yes, I can say something about that. So actually, there are different types of interpretation. You mentioned, consecutive and simultaneous and so on, but also the settings can be different. And why did we choose this to talk about conference and community interpreting? Because usually they're presented as being two things that are very different. And I must say there is some truth in this, because at the UN, our job is mostly formal. We interpret in a very ritualized, formal setting, formal context, and there's not a lot of space for personal interaction between the interpreters and their clients. The delegates, the experts, the diplomats, very often there is even a physical distance, meaning that in a lot of rooms, for duty stations, the booths are sometimes on another level. And so we have a kind of a bird's view of the room. We see the heads, the necks, the backs of our clients, but we don't interact with them a lot. Whereas for community interpreting, things are very different. And I have myself done some community interpreting before joining the UN, and I'm sure a lot of colleagues have experience in this field as well, and maybe in both conference interpreting and community interpreting. And I think that you will agree that it is different. On the other hand, I would like to stress that the difference between these settings is not that clear cut. It is true that usually there is more personal interaction or personal involvement for a community interpreter. But I have noticed, and a lot of colleagues have said the same, is at the UN you have to be prepared to do everything and anything. You can be very surprised sometimes. You can be in a very unusual situation, and that's when maybe experience as a community interpreter can really help. And I can give you maybe an example or two. There are missions. Sometimes we have to go in the field. We travel with the delegates. We get to know them better. And our job then becomes a bit different. We are, of course, helping people to understand each other as usual, but then there's something else. They ask us sometimes, what do you think? Or should we do this or should we do that? And especially things that have to do with some traditions. There are countries, for instance, where you cannot, it's pretty rude to open a present or a gift when you receive it in front of the person who has given it to you. And so this is the kind of thing. I remember someone asking me, should I open this present? It was a very small present. And I said, it's better not to do it now, because actually it's not very polite. You should wait when you're back home, when you're back at your hotel, then you can open your present, but you should not open it in front of the person who is giving to you. And so things of that kind. I also think that the subjects at the UN can be extremely different. As I said, as I mentioned, in Vienna, we have very technical meetings. That's the daily, the daily job we have. But I have experienced, and during missions or even in other places, when I was in New York as well, that you sometimes have to interpret very different things. And I'm thinking now about difficult subjects such as children in armed conflicts, sexual violence, indigenous people and what they've been through or what they're going through still now. And you have to interpret this, and it's sometimes extremely difficult. I remember a special case about children in armed conflict. And my colleague and myself were switching every 5 minutes. We did not respect the half hour that we usually have, because it was so difficult and so demanding emotionally that we could not go on for more than 5 minutes. We had to switch again, calm down, pick ourselves up, and then start again, because we have children ourselves, and it was just unbearable. So I just wanted to say that yes, formal setting, that's true, but we have to be ready for anything and everything, because we're working with human beings, and everything can happen.
And I recall also, usually we are very removed from the speaker, and there's little personal involvement as conference interpreters and as UN interpreters. But I also recall a meeting at the Security Council that those who attended will never forget, when we had the Yazidi Iraqi victim, Nadia Murad, an activist now, testify or give a statement before the Security Council. And it was very moving for everyone who interpreted her and everyone who probably just listened to her as well. It was a detailed account of her experience, and it was very moving. Moving on, we as interpreters, I'm a little conscious of the time where we should be wrapping up, and we're not very, so we'll try to speed up. But as interpreters, of course, we have a margin of error compared to, not error, but we're not expected to be as literally comprehensive as text translators or document translators, because we don't have the luxury of time, obviously. So we primarily focus on essential messages and the meanings, and not the form, not the literal expression, although sometimes, depending on the situation and the speaker, sometimes we will be 100% comprehensive and even literal. and interpreters have different styles as well. Some people will follow the speaker almost word for word, and some speakers will take a lag, some interpreters, I mean, will take a lag behind the speaker and give room for some rephrasing of the message. And because I know the cultural role of interpreters or translators is very dear to the Center for Translation Studies, and I love Dr. Samia Mehraz's class where she focused on that. I cherish the class and her for that, where we spoke about the translator as a cultural mediator. And one of the highlights where this takes place for interpreters is when we are faced with idioms. When you are faced with an idiom, there are somewhat two choices. For one, if it's not one you know, it could be a challenge. But also, if you know the idiom, there are two choices. One, to choose the target culture equivalent from the language, and I will use an example in a second, or to use a more literal interpretation that might or might not always make sense. And that would be a bad choice if it doesn't make sense. But an example here is, there's the phrase in Arabic, ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك كله, right? Most of us know that. And there's an English language equivalent to that, which is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So many interpreters will know that and choose to use it. Some others, so for example, my preference, because I like to transmit a taste of the source culture. So I would like to say, what cannot be attained in full shall not be abandoned in full. You know, something to that effect that gives a taste of the source culture. There's no right and wrong here. And sometimes you don't have the luxury of time. Sometimes you don't know the equivalent. And there's also something to be considered, that the overwhelming majority of audience in the United Nations setting are not native speakers of English. So how does that influence our choice? It's something to be considered, and it's a philosophical point that we will not labor any further. But it's also just very quickly interesting to note that this is the Syrian ambassador, whom we as interpreters really admire and respect, Ustaz Bashar al-Jafari, and he's an eloquent, cultured speaker. He's sometimes challenging because of his imagery and his culture, but he's one of our cherished speakers as interpreters, just, you know, aside from anything else, of course. And we shall move on now. Schools of interpretation, please, Elise.
Yes, we're not going to give a list here of schools. We just wanted to mention that the need for, I mean, the training, the interpreter training in Europe has been really driven by need. There has been a first school, I think it was in 1929 in Mannheim. And then we have, of course, Geneva at the beginning of the 40s and Vienna in 43. And then a huge boom of schools in the 50s and in the 60s that was actually linked to the different stages of the unification of Europe and the building of Europe, and the creation of a whole lot of international organizations such as OECD, OSCE, NATO, and so on, the Council of Europe, and so on. So that's how they added languages in the schools, depending on the needs. Danish, for instance, for the European Union, and all the other ones, and Arabic and Chinese as well. Now, in a lot of schools, for instance, in the Belgian ones that I know better, because there is a need for that.
I'm sorry, Elise, did you speak about upheaval language and interpretation, or should I quickly address that?
No, I think, no. But
okay.
I think it's better maybe if you go on with Arabic, because.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think you can maybe understand, this is how interpreters qualified with their languages to do the job of interpretation. But moving on for shortage of time, it was a turning point that created the need for Arabic interpreter training when it became an official language of the United Nations. The first Arabic linguists, so to speak, who were hired were translators of documents, and they eventually became interpreters, and a few of them trained the first generation of Arabic interpreters who were around and just trickling out of the UN as retirees when I first joined 7 years ago. Some of them had already retired, some were there. They were primarily people who were trained on site. Today, we have a majority of interpreters who have undergone a formal interpreter training. Moving on, we will talk about, yeah, please,
Yeah,
Alice.
very briefly, the things that haunt us all. Well, as you know, speed is something that is a matter of concern for a lot of us, because speed is something that has really changed our way of working. There is a very good study of one of our colleagues, former colleagues in Geneva, Monica Varela, who studied speed and noticed that in her study she had compared, you know, the number of words per minute in 2012 and in 2016, and it had changed from 143 to 162. So it's a lot. It's a big difference. Accents, that can be a challenge as well, even if an accent is a very personal concept. Why is an accent different or difficult for me to understand? Because I probably don't know this accent very well. I have a very dear colleague who has lived in Nigeria, and she has absolutely no problem in interpreting speakers from Nigeria, whereas for an ordinary French interpreter, it is sometimes extremely difficult. The UN jargon and terminology, I think that's something that applies to other organizations as well, or other contexts and formats. There is a specific UN jargon. And I remember a very good interpreter, brilliant, who interpreted for the first time in the ACABQ, which is the Advisory Committee for Budgetary and Administrative Questions. And she said after that, I think I understood about half of it, because there were so many acronyms and so much inside language that it was very difficult at the beginning to understand that. And about the technical content, I think, you know, it's a question of preparation. There is a very good trend now. It started a few years ago to have technical briefings organized for interpreters, when you have experts who come and who just explain to us their craft. And that's really very helpful. We have these in Vienna, we had these in New York as well for some subjects. You have to know what they're talking about. The more you know, the better.
Thank you very much. The challenges apply, all of them with the exception of accents, because to Arabic, because the Arabic speakers all speak in Fusha, of course, as you all know, which is the modern standard Arabic, sometimes called in academic circles of the Arabic language, al-Arabiya al-Mu'asira. So we don't have issues of accents. In my 7 years, there was only one time when I heard an ambassador speak in their local dialect, the local vernacular of the country. But overall, it's the Fusha. Quickly with terminology, some things are specific to the UN. A quick example here, in Egypt, we like to say, when we use development as an adjective or an adverb, we say tanmawi or tanmawiya, and the UN term is inma'i or inma'iyya. So we have the UNDP development program is al-barnamij al-inma'i, not al-tanmawi. And there's technical content, that we prepare for, you know, on UNCITRAL, international trade law, on, you know, international justice, the universal jurisdiction, the first committee topics of disarmament, law of the sea, marine biodiversity. There's so much technical content that we prepare for before our meetings. And then in Arabic, I'm sure you can imagine, writing styles can be so different, and sometimes it's hard to follow the structure. Sometimes you wait so long before the speaker, if the speaker begins with a جملة اسمية with a مبتدأ and khabar, sometimes there are so many جمل اعتراضية, like interjections, clauses, or in any case, before they reach the khabar, and it can be hard to follow sometimes. And then a big issue is acronyms. We got used to it, of course, but just to give you an example, Elise already used ACABQ, which is in Arabic is اللجنة الاستشارية المعنية بشؤون الإدارة والميزانية, and in English everyone just says ACABQ. And another big one for me is QCPR, the Quadrennial Comprehensive Policy Review, and in Arabic that's الاستعراض الدوري الشامل الذي يجري للسياسات كل 4 سنوات. It's so acronyms are a big deal for Arabic interpreters. We are in shortage of time all the time, and we use all sorts of tricks to try to pick up. And just very interesting that we have beautiful diversity in the Arabic booth. This image has 3 in Arabic interpreters from 3 different nationalities: Egyptian, Lebanese, and Algerian, in that one shot of the Arabic booth. Just thought was nice to mention. We will move on. The LCE. Yeah. Yes, please, Louise.
Well, you were talking about acronyms. I think this is a very important one. LCE stands for Language Competitive Exam. And I think we just wanted to mention that this is very important because it's the gateway to enter the UN as a staff interpreter. There is also another way to join, that's with the freelance test, which means that if you pass, you can be recruited for contracts of a week, or several days, or 2 weeks or more. But the LCE is necessary if you want to become a permanent staff member. I'm not going to dwell on it. I think it's work in progress, where everyone, all GT stations are trying to make sure that this exam is as representative as it can be. It's not easy, but we use speeches that have been delivered at the UN with different accents and different speeds and so on to test the candidate. And I could talk a lot about this, but unfortunately we don't have time.
I will also address this very quickly for Arabic. The linguistic standards, no one is expected to be a master of Arabic grammar. We all know that, right? But also the very clear, so most of us, you should be able to deliver 80, actually maybe 90% grammatical accuracy in Arabic. So just the basics of رفع الفاعل والمضارع ونصب المفعول به وجر المجرور مضاف إليه, etc. Some things, just we say in Egyptian Arabic تخرم الودن, they almost hurt the ear when you hear it. If you hear someone use a preposition and then use a رفع or after it instead of المجرور, so just just acceptable level of grammatical accuracy. You can find more about this from languagecareers.un.org. There's also careers.un.org and for all careers at the UN. And I just have to make a quick note that these language professionals in the image from the current website of languagecareers.un.org include Ustaza Hala Talat, who has just retired, I have learned. So just to make this quick notice that she's now a retiree, but that's her image on the website. And there's quickly a very useful resource. I was not able to add it, but there's untermportal.org. I may be able to write it later, but untermportal.org. It's open access to everyone, and it has all the terminology, and it's very useful, and it gives you classifications, and you can use it to find out all technical terminology that the UN uses. Moving on, our separate individual stories. Please, Elise.
Yes, very, very shortly. I just want to say that often it takes time to become an interpreter. And I have studied translation and interpretation, but I did not work immediately as a conference interpreter. I lived in Russia for some years. I mean, that was the Soviet Union at that time. I worked for a trading company. I did other things. I came back. I studied philology. I worked as a translator, as a community interpreter, and then studied again and added 2 other languages, and then worked as a conference interpreter. So I just think sometimes it's, you do other things before, but I'm glad I did it because it just gives me another perspective on things, and joining the UN a bit later is a good thing, maybe, at least for me.
In my case, my path was a little unorthodox. I just happened to grow up with a strong, capacity building, to use a UN term, بناء قدرات, in my 2 languages, I received a bachelor's in accounting, surprising as that sounds, from AUC, but I was never close to being anything close to an accountant, and I was always a writer of sorts and a translator. So I worked jobs as a translator and as a writer, and eventually I did a volunteer job as an interpreter, and it went really well, and it got me interested in becoming a professional interpreter. I did that with Maktabat Iskandariya, the Library of Alexandria, and eventually I did a volunteer job as well with the UN office at Geneva. I got to know the interpreters there, and I'm sure that even though there's no direct relation between that and being hired, but it facilitated the way in some cases. So there's also in some ways there's also some wisdom to be gained here, that I did a volunteer job, but it led me somewhere nicely. And my master's at AUC, teaching Arabic as a foreign language, really improved my my knowledge of grammar, of Arabic grammar. The Arabic language coursework is not that much in the master's, but it was enough to really improve it. And so that helped. Oh, I'm sorry, I flipped the slide without meaning to, but okay, so that's really it. And Elise, please.
Yes, I think we can't finish without mentioning that, of course, COVID-19 has had a very big impact on all of us. I mean, everyone in the world, and also at the UN, and also on interpreters. And the big change is that we have started to consider really remote interpreting, which was not really considered as a point on the agenda a year and a half ago, but now it is. And so I just want to mention that we have, all duty stations have tested, I mean, different platforms. In dispersed mode, which would mean that the interpreters are not in the building, and in co-location, which means that the UN has created a hub where the interpreters can work in special conditions, either in one interpreter per booth, or with a separation between the 2 interpreters in one booth. But it has definitely changed completely the landscape for us. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we have been working now in Vienna last week for the first time, a whole week in co-location, hub mode.
And just a quick note to say, it's not an easy transition for many interpreters. We're already living in a stressful time on a global level for reasons of COVID and other reasons, as we all know and follow what is going on. But this change of what our profession as we know it, our profession as we know it is changing, and it is not easy to embrace, even though we must, because some things you cannot control. And so now with all these, you're even further detached from from your speakers and your colleagues in the dispersed mode, as opposed to the collocation where interpreters are in one place. It's not easy, and you know, it's the future is different than what we've known and become accustomed to. I just wanted, you know, to point that it's a difficult time for many, and this is now what meetings look like. So the Security Council was the, you know, because of the urgency of its work, was the first organ, we call them organ, gehez in Arabic, to implement remote interpretation, and they're working hard on it now. And this is what the meetings look like. You know, they're Zooms, or the equivalent of Zooms. So it's different. You know, the profession is changing, and we last have anecdotes. I don't know if Dina, should we spend, you know, 2 minutes each on anecdotes or no? No. Okay. So so thank you everyone for attending. We're humbled. Thank you, Dina Heshmat. Thank you, Dr. Samia Mehriz. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Elise. Thank you for everyone at the UN who supported this. And we're happy to start interacting.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mustafa and Alice. So we're now ready for the Q&A. I already have a list of questions here, and so I will repeat for those of you who were not there at the beginning with us. So you can send a question via the Q&A, and I will ask it to Mustafa and Alice, or you can use the raise hand function. So I'll begin with a question from Dr. Samia Mehriz, who says, hello to you. And so her question is, to what extent is your multilingualism determined by the lexicon of the UN? And to what extent can we really say that this is indeed multilingualism in the broad sense of the concept, right? So this is a broad question. So if you want to go on this, we can. I can also give you a series other questions if you would like to. That can also be an option. Yes, if you prefer. So there are other questions here. The other questions are, there is a question, a quite technical question about, yes, so I'm here with you about relay 4x2 and 2x3. Does anyone in French, English, Spanish, Russian booth have Arabic or Chinese as passive languages? Or are the Arabic Chinese booths autonomous? So that is one question. Another question is, what is the difference between official and working language? Third question is a question about Arabic interpreters. A question for you, Mustafa, about any Arabic specific tips for Arabic interpreters. I mean, you addressed some of these. So these are some of the questions that I got until now. So I suggest you go first. Maybe you can take 5 minutes each to address those, and then I'll open the floor because I see that I have a number of hands raised here. Okay, so maybe 5 minutes each, not more. Yeah.
I did not do a good job of writing down the questions. I don't know if Alice, do you want to start, or should I try to?
Well, I can start about the Arabic and Chinese booth. To my knowledge, I don't know personally anyone in the French, English, Spanish, and Russian booth. Yes, Russian booth, I know someone, a freelancer who had Arabic actually, and he could work directly from Arabic. The problem is he worked from Arabic into Russian, but that means that people who do not know Russian had to take relay anyhow from the Arabic booth to have French or English. So it did not solve the problem, if I can put it that way. Who knows? Maybe things will change in the future. That means that people have to, you know, learn more. But there are sometimes people who have, like he has, a good passive Arabic C. There's someone in the French booth as well who can work directly from Arabic into French. I don't know anyone, any staff member with Chinese, but freelance, yes. But in any case, it does not solve the problem of the coverage of all languages. So we still have this, I think we'll still need this system. And about working languages and official, well, the working languages are the languages that are used by the staff to communicate between themselves. So for instance, per mail or whatever. So that's the difference between official and working.
And
yeah, a question about the influence of the jargon of the UN on our multilingualism.
There's definitely is a jargon, and as it is practiced, you know, people rarely defy the styles and the lexicon of the UN. So so yes, the multilingualism at the UN is shaped by the multilateralism in which it operates, and it shapes our choices. And sometimes, like today, when I was trying to explain it, sometimes it influences our personal choices. When I was trying to say that I grew up with good, you know, education of both Arabic and English, I said capacity building, which is very which is a UN term without a doubt. So yes, it influences our choices, and it does strongly shape what multilingualism is at the United Nations, I think.
Okay. So I have a question here from Layo Hin Sao. I'm sorry for the pronunciation, so I'll give you the floor now. Yes, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. I see that Liu Hin Sao is back. Liu Hin Sao, I apologize for the pronunciation of your name. Please, you can talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this talk. Well, I come from University of Vienna, and my research focuses on simultaneous interpretation with text in the context of the UN. So I would like to ask two questions. The first question is, I want to ask both of you, do you feel like a difference in your performance and output when you work in the traditional way of simultaneous interpretation and when you work in a mode of simultaneous interpretation with text? So this is my first question. And then the second question is, I wonder, are the non-semantic features of interpretations like fluency, naturalness of language, and then the user's satisfaction, by which I mean delegate satisfaction, are they very important factors when you evaluate the quality of an interpretation? Thank you.
Yes, please go.
Yes.
So I'll start from the end about client feedback at the UN. There's officially, when there's a resolution in the Security Council that is tabled and they put it in the color blue, and there's something called the no objection procedure, or sometimes the silence procedure, and it's إجراء عدم الاعتراض. So that's kind of what applies to our clients. If we don't hear of complaints, then we're doing okay. It does happen, but it's not common that people praise our work. But it's not very common. The use of text in my personal experience differs with my two active languages. When I have an English text, when I'm interpreting into Arabic, it is helpful. When I have an Arabic text, it is very, very helpful if it came enough time before the speaker took the floor and I was able to review it and prepare it before interpreting the speaker. However, if I am interpreting the speaker, you know, and I have not seen the text, personally, many of my colleagues are not like that. They are able to use an Arabic text to their advantage and interpret into English and French, or French. However, in my case, if I have not had the chance to look at it before, I am personally better off without the Arabic text. That is my experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, as you said, feedback, we usually, if something goes wrong, I can guarantee you will have feedback. You will know about it, and it's usually painful. It can happen. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And usually when they're happy, they don't say anything, but they sometimes do. And sometimes we had some, I mean, I have examples of clients who waited for us at the, at the door and wanted to thank us, and we're very happy, and which is really great. About the text, I would say it depends on the language for me. For instance, it's very useful for me to have the Russian text, because Russian has a word order that differs very much from French. And so I can anticipate much better, because I just know what he's going to, or she is going to talk about. Whereas if I don't have the text, the speaker can start his or her sentence, and I really don't know where he's going or where she's going. So this helps, and it helps a lot to have acronyms and figures and things like that. But it can be dangerous when you start doing site translation without listening. That's why it's written that it's always written check against delivery on the text at the UN.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
If I can quickly also just say something interesting, a French colleague here in New York recently used a metaphor for an interpreter and compared an interpreter to a duck. And the duck, you see the duck, speaking of Lynn's point of the delivery and the tonation. So a duck is gliding, you see the duck above the water surface, gliding, cruising, looking very graceful. But in fact, underwater, her legs are the duck's legs are flapping really fast. The feet are flapping really fast. And that's kind of what an interpreter does, especially at the UN. Our delivery is very important. We need to be collected and coherent, but at the same time to be able to do so while focusing on our message, our completeness and accuracy and linguistic quality. Inside we're flapping like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I have other hands here. Ahmed Al-Wakil.
Hey. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, Mustafa. Hello, Alice. And hello, Dr. Dina. My question is directed to both Mustafa and Alice. For Mustafa, this is a very important question for me. What resources do you use to continuously develop your vocabulary? And also, in general, are interpreters or do interpreters only translate to their own mother tongue? Thank you.
So I'll start. Okay, so for vocabulary, contrary to what people think, vocabulary is not a big challenge for us because we prepare our specific meetings. So when the member states, when delegations are meeting, there's an agenda that we know usually beforehand. And there are documents, reports that they will discuss and comment on. So we're able to prepare that, and we have access, of course, to tools at the UN, such as the terminology database that I mentioned, and a few other tools as well. So we're able to prepare the content. It's the speed that really challenges us, not the vocabulary or the terminology.
Okay, Mustafa. What I mean, excuse me. Sorry for interruption. What I mean is that I'm not talking about specific vocabs. I'm talking about your style. Over the years, do you read books? Do you read specific texts? To make a rich vocabs. What differentiates an interpreter from another is his using of words, rich words, strong words. This is what I mean. If you understand me.
So like I said earlier, the audience of, for example, my audience when I'm interpreting Arabic into English, the majority of the audience of the clients are not native English speakers. So, it's tricky how flowery or how sophisticated the language you use will be. You want to be clear, you want the message to be delivered and you don't want to complicate it. So was it George Orwell, or I'm not sure who, but if there are two word choices to express the same thought, the simpler is the better one. So we have to be conscious of that and of our colleagues who will take relay from us. So me, of course, I don't read as much as I would like to be reading, as much as I've read in the past, between kids and so much else. But definitely there's constant reading, but more important than general reading, there's constant reading of day-to-day current events. You have to be aware of what's going on and follow current events on the global stage.
Yeah. But my second question is, only interpreters, do they only translate to their mother tongue? I mean, you only translate to Arabic?
Alice?
No. I mean, in the Arabic and Chinese booth, interpreters work into French or into English as well. They have to be able to do that to be recruited.
Thank you.
And in the other 4 booths, they only interpret into their mother tongue, yes.
Yeah, and they sometimes have a B language, or a double A, which means they can work in 2 different mother tongues, but it's not very often. But there are some. We have colleagues who do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I have another question here about, is there an age restriction for those who are over 40 to apply for translation jobs at the UN? So several persons asked the same question.
I have if I remember well, I think it's 46 or 47, the limit. It must be somewhere. We can find this information and confirm. There is an age limit, but it's not that low, actually.
Okay. Okay, so I have several hands still here. Maybe we can take still a few questions, maybe 1 or 2 questions before we close and conclude. Joe Kelly.
Yes, my name is Joy. I'm a Cairo-based Arabic English interpreter. And my questions actually were mentioned on the Q&A, but maybe it didn't have they didn't find their way to be answered. So specifically, my questions are to Mustafa. What does it take to become a UN interpreter? And if there is any Arabic specific tips for Arabic interpreters? And second question, also related to the first one, is how do we improve our accuracy, speed, and completeness skills in order to meet the requirements of the LCE or the freelance test?
So practice, of course. And one thing that I think many of us do all the time is record oneself. So when I record myself, I'm able to evaluate my own performance. Of course, the use of a colleague is also helpful if it's possible. But that's one of the best ways to identify your weaknesses and try to remedy them when you listen to your own self. There's webtv.un.org. Hopefully we will make sure Dr. Dina has all of these and she can send them out later. But webtv.un.org is the webcast of the United Nations. There are lots of videos there of statements, of meetings in different languages, and you can play these and interpret. Arabic specifically, I think it's just about working on your delivery, like with any other language. I'm not sure if, grammar aside, we agreed that there's a minimum for the quality of our grammar. We're not expected, almost no one, very few people in the Arabic speakers can produce 100% grammatical accuracy. But as now, especially that the profession is well established, I've come at a time when the first generation of Arabic interpreters, some of them, the strength was just the foreign language. So their Arabic, we know none of us speak in our daily lives, none of us speak Fusha, right? So many interpreters do not have a strong standard Arabic, modern standard Arabic Fusha quality. But now there are. I mean, now more and more we have trained, strongly qualified interpreters, as I'm sure you are, Joy. And so if there's too many Arab mistakes, like syntax mistakes, grammar mistakes, then it's a weakness. So maybe you can work on that, but it's not so difficult if that's what you do.
Okay, thank you. So I have several questions still here. Mahmoud al-Sibai.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for this very rich webinar. We have enjoyed it. Excuse me. My name is Mahmoud and I am an English Arabic interpreter based in Toronto, Canada. I have two questions. Sorry, there are two for Mustafa. Mustafa, if you could take us please through the testing for the UN positions. Maybe, for example, the requirements, do we need to ABB or ABC or just A and B? The components of the test, if possible, and if there are any differences between the tests for freelance and staff interpreters. And also my second question is, you mentioned there are several challenges when it comes to the Arabic language in interpretation. And you mentioned speed and terminology, and also you highlighted acronyms. And I agree with you. And I would like to ask you, is there any specific tips or coping techniques that you people use at the Arabic booth to cope with acronyms? I think most languages have acronyms and we don't. So like, how do you handle acronyms in an time-efficient way that saves you a couple of seconds or fragments of seconds even? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So on the first part of the question, testing, they're announced through the careers website and Inspira as well. And the way they work is there are three. Well, for one, to qualify, you need to have a certain number of hours as a professional interpreter. I'm not sure, or a number of days. I'm not sure what that requirement is right now. But then if you qualify for the LCE, then you sit for an exam where you interpret 3 passages into your A language and 3 passages into your B language as an Arabic interpreter. So for someone who does, who's an Anglophone like me, the 3 are in ascending difficulty. So the first one is relatively simple, then a little more complicated, and the third is a little more complicated. I think they're mostly in the the ballpark of 5 minutes, or even maybe 4, and then 3 into English. So 3 into Arabic, 3 into English, both in ascending difficulty. The acronyms, yeah, so there are in some cases an Arabic interpreter will use the full translation in the beginning and then use the English acronym. People have different feelings about that, but in general, the Arabic clients know the acronyms. So that is one likely option. Another is to, after you use the complete name, to use an abbreviated part of the name. So like, for example, the ACABQ is اللجنة الاستشارية المعنية بشؤون الإدارة والميزانية, and then, going on because of the context, when you say just اللجنة الاستشارية, people understand. The clients understand what you're talking about. The same thing goes for QCPR. You could just say, after you've said a few times, الاستعراض الدوري الشامل الذي يجري الاستعراض الدوري الشامل للسياسات الذي يجري كل 4 سنوات, then you could say استعراض الدوري الشامل. So these are the 2, I think, main coping strategies for acronyms.
Okay, thank you, Mustafa. I have a last question here sent by Dr. Samia Mehriz. Maybe this is a question for you, Alice, or maybe you as well afterwards, Mustafa. You want to talk about this because you referred to it in your talk, Alice, when you were talking about how emotionally difficult it could be to interpret sometimes. So the question is about how burnt out you are after an interpreting session, and is the compensation worth the stress? So this will be our last question. Please,
Well, the answer is the second answer is yes, and the first, I mean, and the first answer, the answer to the first question is, well, it can be exhausting. It usually is. And when it's emotionally challenging because the subject touches us very much, then it's even more challenging, because it's not only the fact that you have to be concentrated and deliver, but you have to make sure you protect yourself as well. And you have to divide yourself. It's kind of schizophrenic, because you cannot be, I cannot be Alice. I have to be 200% an interpreter, otherwise I will not be able to deliver. And it's very difficult. So I really have to have the opportunity after that to share with someone, or to get the stress out, or probably to share, because I was remembering another example where I was talking about children in armed conflicts, but also with genital feminine mutilation, which is absolutely horrendous. And when you have to interpret this and testimonies with diagrams and photos, and I mean, it's horrible. That was one of the most challenging meetings of my life, because I was just wondering how I was going to get, to the end of it, and knowing that I had to, it was very important. But you have to have something, to be able to share this with a colleague, with a friend, with someone in your family, partner, or whatever. Because it's difficult. We're human beings. We're not machines. And up to now, machines have not replaced us. So we're going to do the job.
Okay. Thank you, Alice. Mustafa?
So that's why, yes, they can be challenging, and that's why we work in half-hour intervals. And sometimes in 20-minute intervals, but in the emotional speakers happen, but they're not that common. But what is slightly more common, especially for us as Egyptians and Arabs, is when you have a speaker who represents the opposite of the majority political view in the Arab world. I'm not going to name anything, but when you have a speaker who really represents the opposite of a lot of what you stand for and what you support, and you have to be detached. You have to interpret that speaker in the same quality and dedication as you do anyone else. And that speaker, it can be an ambassador, it can be a smaller diplomat in a delegation, a younger, diplomat in a delegation. It can be a head of state during that 1 week high-level General Assembly meeting in September. And that's challenging. That's challenging because sometimes you get really provoked and you have to control that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mustafa Hashish. Thank you very much, Alice Reikmans, for a very rich, dense, and useful talk. Thank you very much to all of you for attending tonight, and we will send you soon updates about the lectures of the Center for Translation Studies at the American University in Cairo that will resume next fall. So thank you very much to all of you. And
thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dina, Dr. Samia, everyone in attendance. Thank you very much for participating.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.